It was an ordinary morning, or at least, it should have been. I woke up in my tiny room, the sun peeking through the blinds. Nothing special, just the usual routine. I didn't have a closet full of fancy clothes like some people, so I picked out the same simple dress I always wore. It had been handed down from my older sister, and although it wasn't the newest or the most stylish, it was comfortable, and it was mine. I quickly put on a pair of worn-out shoes, grabbed my bag, and headed out the door. The walk to the cafe was short, and I usually didn't mind it. Today, though, something felt different. As I passed by people on the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Their eyes seemed to follow me more than usual. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. When I stepped into the cafe, I felt the same odd sensation. There were a few familiar faces in the crowd, people I had seen countless times before. Yet today, they seemed to look at me in a way I couldn't explain. I walked up to the counter, trying to ignore the feeling, and ordered my usual coffee. The barista smiled at me, but it didn't feel genuine. It was as if everyone in the room was silently judging me. I didn't understand why. I hadn't done anything wrong. I grabbed my drink and found a seat by the window. As I sipped my coffee, I overheard a conversation from the table next to me. Two women were talking, but their words were loud enough for me to hear. "Did you see what she's wearing today?" One of them said, laughing under her breath. "I mean, who still wears stuff like that?" I froze. My stomach twisted. I looked down at my dress, suddenly aware of every little imperfection. My heart started to race. Was I really being talked about? The other woman giggled. "It's like she doesn't even try. She could look so much better if she cared." They both chuckled again, their voices dripping with judgment. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to sink into the floor and vanish from their sight. But there I was, sitting in a cafe, feeling as small as possible. I didn't want to make a scene, so I kept my head low, hoping they wouldn't notice me. But it didn't stop there. The comments kept coming, louder and more cruel, as if they couldn't care less about how much they hurt me. "Poor thing," one of them said. "She doesn't even know how to dress herself." The words felt like daggers. I took a deep breath, trying to keep calm. My hands were shaking, but I told myself to hold it together. I had to. I couldn't let them see how much they were affecting me. But it was hard. The laughter continued, and all I could think about was how out of place I felt in that cafe. How my clothes made me feel like an outsider. I quickly finished my coffee, stood up, and walked out the door. The cool air outside didn't do much to ease the heat rising in my cheeks. I walked faster, not looking back, my mind racing. How could people be so cruel? Why did it matter so much to them what I wore? I didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. I couldn't go on like this. I had to do something. I didn't know what yet, but I was determined to figure it out. As I walked home, I felt a mix of frustration and confusion. I had always been a simple person, and I never cared much about appearances. But now, everything felt different. I wanted to prove to myself that I was worth more than the clothes I wore. I just didn't know how to begin. The next day, everything felt like a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about what happened at the cafe. The laughter, the harsh words, it kept playing in my head over and over. I tried to tell myself it wasn't a big deal. I told myself they didn't matter, that their opinions didn't define me. But the truth was, it hurt. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. When I walked into the cafe the following morning, the air felt thick with tension. The same people were there, sitting in their usual spots. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped inside. I quickly looked down at my dress, feeling the familiar wave of discomfort wash over me. The same simple dress, the same worn-out shoes. I could already feel the eyes on me, judging me, just like yesterday. I stood in line, trying to focus on the menu, but I could feel their stares. Their whispers. It was like I was on display, and everyone was talking about me without even saying a word. My hands began to shake. I looked at the counter and noticed the barista, who had been so kind to me before, now giving me a strange look. It wasn't rude, but it wasn't warm either. I could see it in his eyes. He was thinking the same thing as everyone else. As I waited for my order, I heard a familiar voice behind me. It was one of the women from the day before, the one who had laughed the loudest. "Isn't she brave?" she whispered to her friend, loud enough for me to hear. "Wearing that dress again. I mean, doesn't she realize how bad it looks?" Her friend giggled, and they both stared at me as if I were some kind of joke. I wanted to shrink into the floor, to vanish completely. I wanted to turn around and yell at them, to tell them how hurtful they were, but I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I just stood there, trying to act normal, pretending I didn't hear them. But every word felt like a knife, cutting deeper into my confidence. I finally got my coffee, my hand still trembling as I took the cup. I looked around for an empty seat, but all I could think about was getting out of there. The cafe suddenly felt so small, so suffocating. I felt like everyone was watching me, judging me for something as simple as my clothes. As I walked to an empty table in the corner, I could hear the soft whispers starting again. "Did you see her shoes?" One woman said. "They're so old. How embarrassing." Another voice chimed in. "She must not care at all." I wanted to run. I wanted to hide. But I didn't. I sat down, staring at the table, trying to hold it together. My chest felt tight, and tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. But I didn't let them fall. I couldn't. I couldn't let anyone see how much they were getting to me. The rest of my time at the cafe was a blur. Every laugh, every whispered comment made me feel smaller and smaller. By the time I finished my coffee, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I paid for my drink and walked out quickly, keeping my head down, hoping that no one would look at me. Once I was outside, the cool air didn't make me feel better. If anything, it only made me feel colder. I kept walking, my thoughts racing. Why did it matter so much to them what I wore? Why did it hurt so much? I felt like an outsider, like I didn't belong. It was the first time I realized how deeply people could judge you, even for the smallest things. And in that moment, all I could think was that I needed to change. I couldn't stay like this, letting other people's opinions control how I felt about myself. But how? Where would I even start? The next few days felt like a constant battle. Every time I walked out the door, it was as if I was bracing myself for the stares, the whispers, the judgment. I tried to tell myself that I shouldn't care, that I shouldn't let the opinions of strangers get under my skin. But the truth was, it was hard not to. It was hard not to feel like I was being watched, like my every move was being judged. On the third day after the cafe incident, I woke up feeling different. I wasn't sure why, but something inside me had shifted. Maybe it was because I had reached my breaking point. I couldn't keep living like this, feeling small and invisible every time I left the house. I needed a change. I needed to do something to prove to myself that I was worth more than what they saw on the outside. So that morning, I decided to take action. I picked out a different outfit, a new combination of clothes that was simple but felt more put together. I didn't have a lot of money to spend, so I made do with what I had, mixing and matching the few things I owned. I figured it would be a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. It was time to show up for myself, even if no one else was willing to do it for me. When I walked into the cafe that morning, I tried to walk with more confidence. I held my head up high, even though my heart was still racing in my chest. I didn't want to be afraid anymore. I didn't want to let the looks and the whispers make me feel small. I wanted to prove that I was more than my clothes. As I stood in line waiting for my coffee, I felt the familiar eyes on me again. The whispers started almost immediately. "Look at her today," I heard a woman say. "She's trying so hard. Does she really think this makes a difference?" My stomach tightened, but I kept my gaze straight ahead, refusing to let them see how much it hurt. This time, I wasn't going to let them win. I wouldn't let their words control me. But the more I heard, the harder it became to ignore. "She doesn't know how to dress properly," another woman muttered. "She's still not good enough." Those words felt like a punch to the gut, but I didn't flinch. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply they were getting to me. Instead, I walked up to the counter, my hand steady even though my insides were shaking. I ordered my coffee, keeping my voice calm. The barista smiled, but it didn't feel like the same warm smile as before. I knew they were all thinking the same thing. Who did I think I was, walking in here dressed like this? After I paid, I glanced around the cafe. And that's when I saw her, one of the women who had been laughing at me the other day. She was sitting at a table with her friends, her eyes locked onto me, studying me as if I were some kind of puzzle. I could feel her gaze burning into me, and I couldn't look away. She raised an eyebrow and said something to her friend in a low voice, but I heard every word. "She really thinks she looks good, doesn't she?" I felt my cheeks flush. The humiliation threatened to rise again, but I forced myself to stand tall. I turned away from her gaze, picked up my coffee, and walked to an empty table in the corner. It wasn't easy, but I knew I couldn't let her win. I couldn't let them see how much their words bothered me. As I sat there, my mind raced. Was it worth it? Was it worth fighting this battle, putting myself out there, only to be torn down again? But then I remembered something my mom used to tell me. The only person who gets to decide your worth is you. With those words in my mind, I took a deep breath and kept my eyes forward. I knew the journey wasn't over. I knew the stares would continue, and the whispers would probably never stop. But I also knew that I had a choice. I could either let them control me or I could rise above it. And that day, I chose to rise. The days after that moment at the cafe were a blur. Each time I stepped outside, it felt like the weight of everyone's judgment followed me. I couldn't seem to shake the feeling that people were watching me, talking about me. But as much as the whispers hurt, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep living in fear of what others thought. It was time to take control, to stop letting their opinions hold power over me. I spent the next evening thinking about my options. I needed a plan. I wasn't going to let myself feel embarrassed anymore, but I also knew that changing my mindset wouldn't be enough. I had to take action. I had to change how I looked, how I carried myself, and most importantly, how I saw myself. I thought about all the women I had seen in the cafe and other places, how confident they seemed, how effortless their style was. I wasn't saying I wanted to be like them, but I wanted to feel that same confidence. I didn't need to wear expensive clothes or follow the latest trends. I just needed to feel good in my own skin, to feel proud of who I was. I knew that if I could start feeling better about myself, the way others saw me might not matter as much. The next morning, I woke up with a new sense of purpose. I had to find a way to build my confidence, and it didn't start with anyone else's approval. It started with me. I decided to spend the day doing something that would help me feel better, something that would shift my focus from what others thought to what I thought about myself. First, I went through my closet. It wasn't much, just a few simple pieces of clothing that I had collected over the years. I wasn't rich, and I didn't have the money to buy a new wardrobe, but I realized I didn't need to. I could mix and match what I already had. The key was wearing clothes that made me feel good, clothes that felt comfortable, but also gave me a little boost of confidence. So I took some time to create new outfits from the things I owned, putting together looks that felt more polished than what I usually wore. After that, I moved on to my hair. I hadn't really paid attention to it much before, but now I wanted to. I found a tutorial online for a simple hairstyle that looked neat and put together. I didn't need to be a professional, but just taking the time to do something with my hair made a difference. I felt a little more in control, a little more like the person I wanted to be. Next, I decided to do something for my mind. I started writing in a journal, something I had never really done before. I used to think it was silly, but writing down my thoughts helped me sort through all the emotions that had been building up inside me. I wrote about the cafe incident, about how I felt humiliated and small, But I also wrote about how I wanted to move forward. I wrote about the strength I had within me, even if I couldn't always see it. The more I wrote, the clearer things became. I realized that I didn't need anyone's approval to feel good about myself. I was enough, just as I was. After a few days of doing small things to build my confidence, I felt different. It wasn't a huge change, but it was something. I started to walk a little taller, smile a little more. I felt like I was in control of my own story. The more I focused on myself, the less I cared about what others thought. I knew I wasn't perfect, but I was learning to embrace who I was. I still had moments of doubt, moments when I felt insecure, but those moments didn't define me anymore. I realized that I didn't need to change for anyone else. I just needed to change for myself. And that was the most powerful transformation of all. It had been a few weeks since I decided to take control of my life. Little by little, I was starting to feel like a different person. The small changes I had made, how I dressed, how I styled my hair, and the way I began to see myself, were slowly starting to add up. I wasn't perfect, and I didn't have all the answers, but I was getting closer to feeling confident and comfortable in my own skin. I had taken the first steps toward becoming the person I always wanted to be. One afternoon, I stood in front of my mirror, looking at the woman who stared back at me. I couldn't help but smile. I hadn't realized it at first, but something had changed. My posture was different. I wasn't slouching or hiding anymore. I stood tall, my shoulders back, my chin lifted just a little higher. My clothes weren't expensive or brand new, but they felt different on me now. They weren't just pieces of fabric. They were part of me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt good about it. I wasn't letting the opinions of others control me anymore. I had stopped caring so much about what people thought of me. It wasn't that I didn't care at all. It was just that I cared more about how I felt. I had started to put myself first. I had to. If I didn't, I'd continue to let the world's opinions shape my self-worth. And I was done with that. I wanted to feel confident, not just on the outside, but on the inside too. I started to notice that the more confident I became, the less I felt like I had to prove anything to anyone. People who once made me feel small no longer affected me the same way. Their stares, their whispers, they no longer held power over me. Instead of feeling humiliated, I felt free. I could hold my head up high without worrying about what others thought. I wasn't dressing for them anymore. I was dressing for myself. One afternoon, as I was walking down the street, I heard a familiar voice behind me. It was one of the women from the cafe, the one who had made the harshest comments about me. She was walking with a friend, laughing and talking, but when she saw me, her expression shifted. She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes locking onto me. For a second, I thought she might say something rude again, but she didn't. Instead, she just looked at me, her eyes wide. I didn't know if it was surprise or something else, but I didn't care. I didn't need her approval anymore. As I kept walking, I realized that I wasn't afraid of her anymore. I wasn't afraid of anyone's judgment. My transformation wasn't just about the way I looked or how I dressed. It was about how I carried myself, how I held my head up high, and how I had learned to stop letting others control how I felt about myself. I knew this wasn't the end of my journey. I still had moments when I felt insecure, when I questioned my choices or doubted myself. But now, I had the tools to pick myself back up. I knew that I had the power to define who I was, not anyone else. And that was enough. A few days later, I got a message from an old friend. It was an invitation to a charity gala that was happening in the city. The thought of it made my heart race. I had never been to something so fancy before. Part of me felt nervous. Would I belong there? Would I feel out of place? But then I remembered everything I had been through, everything I had learned about myself. I wasn't the same person who had walked into that cafe weeks ago. I was stronger. I was more confident. I could do this. I smiled as I typed my response. I was ready for whatever came next, because now I knew that the only approval I needed was my own. The day of the charity gala arrived, and I couldn't shake off the mix of excitement and nervousness. I had never been to an event like this before. The thought of attending a fancy gathering made me feel a little out of my element, but it also made me feel proud. I was no longer the same person who had been afraid of what others thought. I had worked hard to build my confidence, and now I was putting it to the test. I spent hours getting ready, carefully choosing an outfit from my wardrobe. It wasn't the most glamorous dress, but it was one that made me feel comfortable and confident. I paired it with a simple pair of shoes I had cleaned up to make them look new. My hair, which I had started to take better care of, was styled neatly, and I felt a little spark of pride as I looked at myself in the mirror. I took a deep breath before leaving the house. This was my moment. I wasn't going to let my nerves get the best of me. I had worked too hard to get here, to let the past hold me back. As I stepped out of the door, I reminded myself that I was worthy of being there, just like anyone else. When I arrived at the gala, the entrance was grand, with lights twinkling in every corner. People in elegant outfits walked around, laughing and chatting in groups. The atmosphere was both exciting and intimidating. I couldn't help but feel like a fish out of water at first. I was used to small gatherings, not events like this, where everyone seemed to know each other. But I pushed those feelings aside. I had been through too much to let my insecurities ruin this moment. As I entered the venue, I felt a few eyes turn toward me. Some people were dressed in expensive suits and dresses, their jewelry sparkling in the light. At first, I felt a little out of place, but then I remembered what I had learned over the past weeks. This event wasn't about who had the most expensive clothes or the best shoes. It was about being there, being part of something important, and having the confidence to enjoy the moment. I spotted a few familiar faces from the cafe, including one of the women who had been especially harsh to me in the past. She was standing near the entrance, looking stunning in a designer dress. As soon as she saw me, her eyes widened in surprise. For a moment, I wondered if she would say something rude or try to make me feel uncomfortable, but instead, she just stared at me. I held my head up high, keeping my smile steady, and walked past her without a second thought. The night went on, and to my surprise, I started to enjoy myself. I talked to people, smiled, and even laughed a few times. I didn't feel like an outsider anymore. The old fears of judgment that had haunted me in the past seemed distant now. I was in control. I was proving to myself that I could handle any situation, no matter how intimidating it seemed at first. As the evening wore on, I felt a shift within me. I wasn't just attending the gala because I had been invited. I was there because I belonged. I belonged in that room, and I deserved to be seen, just as much as anyone else. The woman from the cafe eventually approached me. I braced myself, not sure what to expect. She smiled, a little awkwardly, and said, "You look really nice tonight." I could tell she was trying to be polite, but the sincerity in her voice caught me off guard. She wasn't mocking me or judging me this time. It was a simple compliment, but it meant a lot. I smiled back and said, "Thank you." It wasn't the apology I had expected, but it was enough. In that moment, I realized that I didn't need anyone's approval to feel good about myself. I had already done the hard work. I had already changed the way I saw myself. And that was all that mattered. The night ended on a high note. As I left the gala, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. I had faced my fears and stepped out of my comfort zone. I had learned to stand tall and be proud of who I was, no matter where I was or who I was surrounded by. And for the first time in a long time, I truly believe that I was enough. After the gala, I felt different. Not because of the compliments or the fancy event, but because of how I had carried myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had truly embraced who I was, flaws and all. That night had marked a turning point in my life, and I knew things would never be the same again. The weeks that followed were full of small victories. I didn't suddenly become perfect or completely confident overnight, but I learned how to handle situations that would have made me shrink before. Every day was a new opportunity to show up for myself, to practice self-love and confidence, and most importantly, to stop seeking approval from others. One of the first things I noticed was how my relationships with others began to change. Before, I had always been so focused on what people thought of me that it affected how I interacted with them. I was nervous, always second-guessing myself. Now, I didn't feel that pressure anymore. I started having real conversations with people, not worried about what they might think or how they might judge me. There was a moment when I ran into one of my old friends from high school. We hadn't spoken in years, but we had stayed connected on social media. When she saw me, she was almost unrecognizable. Her style had changed, and she looked like she had gained a lot of confidence over the years. We exchanged greetings, and as we chatted, I realized something. She was no different than me. We had both gone through our own struggles, our own growth. We had both learned how to become comfortable in our own skin, even if it took time. We spent the next few hours catching up, laughing, and sharing stories about how much we had changed. It felt good to connect with someone who truly understood what it was like to go through the journey of finding yourself. We laughed about old memories, but we also talked about our new lives. It was a reminder that change was possible, no matter how long it took. A few days later, I went back to the cafe, the place where it all started. The same people were there, sitting in their usual spots, but this time, something was different. I didn't feel their stares or their whispers. I felt calm. I felt like I had finally found my place, not just in the cafe, but in the world. I ordered my coffee, smiling to myself, and sat down at my usual spot. This time, I didn't care about what anyone thought. As I sipped my coffee, I caught a glimpse of one of the women who had mocked me before. She was sitting with a friend, talking and laughing. When she looked over at me, I didn't flinch. I didn't feel that familiar knot in my stomach. Instead, I smiled and looked away. I wasn't angry or upset. I had learned that people's opinions didn't have the power to ruin my day anymore. I had finally taken control of my own life. The more time passed, the more I realized how much power we all have over our own happiness. It doesn't come from the approval of others, or from wearing the most stylish clothes, or from fitting into any mold. It comes from within. It comes from knowing that you are enough, just as you are. I began to look at myself in the mirror and see not just the person I was, but the person I was becoming. I was proud of that person. The journey wasn't always easy, but it was mine, and it had made me stronger. I had faced my fears, walked through the discomfort, and come out the other side knowing that I was worthy of love, respect, and kindness, especially from myself. Looking back at everything I had been through, I understood one thing clearly. No matter how simple or how difficult the journey had been, I had learned the most important lesson of all. That true confidence doesn't come from outside. It comes from within. And that no one could ever take away from me. Months had passed since that turning point at the gala, and every day I felt more like the person I was always meant to be. I had gone through so many changes, emotionally, mentally, and even in the way I carried myself. The road hadn't always been smooth, but it had been worth every step. Now, when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw someone who was stronger, braver, and more confident than ever before. I had learned that confidence wasn't something you could buy, and it wasn't something that came from what others thought of you. It came from within. It was about embracing your uniqueness, accepting your flaws, and knowing your worth. And most importantly, it was about letting go of the fear of judgment from others. One afternoon, I sat down to think about how far I had come. I had achieved things I never thought were possible before. I had faced my insecurities head-on and made the decision to live for myself, not for anyone else. I didn't care about fitting in anymore. I didn't need to be like everyone else. I had learned to love my individuality, and I was proud of who I was becoming. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to another event. This time, a small gathering of people who were passionate about social causes. I hesitated at first. I thought about how this was another chance to face the uncomfortable feeling of not belonging. But then, something inside me said, "You've got this." This wasn't about being perfect or looking a certain way. It was about being myself and doing something meaningful. The night of the event, I walked in with a sense of purpose. No longer worried about how I looked or whether I would be accepted, I focused on the people around me and the cause we were supporting. I listened to others, shared my thoughts, and found myself having real, genuine conversations. For once, I wasn't pretending to be someone I wasn't. I was just me, unapologetically me. As the night went on, I realized how much had changed in such a short time. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. I was stepping into opportunities, embracing the challenges and growing from them. I had learned that the more I focused on myself and my own growth, the less the opinions of others mattered. I also began to understand that life wasn't just about the big moments, the galas, the parties, the awards. It was about the everyday choices. It was about waking up every morning and deciding to be the best version of yourself. It was about having the courage to be real, to be kind, and to keep going even when it felt hard. Soon, I found myself reflecting on my journey more often. I thought about how the woman who had once felt so small had transformed into someone who stood tall, someone who wasn't afraid to step into any room, no matter who was watching or what they thought. I had found my voice, my strength, and most importantly, my peace. The fear that once held me back now seemed distant. It was as if it had never been there. I realized that the journey wasn't over. Life would always have its ups and downs, but I knew now that I had the tools to handle whatever came my way. I had learned to trust myself, to believe in myself, and to understand that I was enough, just as I was. As I walked away from the event that night, I smiled to myself. The world hadn't changed, but I had. And that made all the difference. I was no longer afraid of what the world thought of me. I was more focused on the person I was becoming and the impact I could make. There would always be challenges ahead, but I knew I had the strength to face them. I was ready for whatever the future held, because now I knew that the only opinion that truly mattered was mine. And with that confidence, there was nothing I couldn't do.